So apparently Sword Art Online is getting a new game called Echoes of Aincrad, which is set to release in July 2026, and it already looks absolutely awful. For starters, who even wanted another Sword Art Online game in the first place? The series has been milked again and again, and every time it shows up it feels like the same lazy idea with a new coat of paint. Nobody was sitting around begging for this. Nobody was saying, yes, please give us another one of these. Yet here it is anyway. It feels like the people behind it looked around, saw that the name still gets attention, and decided that was good enough. No effort, no care. Just slap the brand on a box and push it out the door. That is what this looks like. It looks cheap. It looks rushed. It looks like something made by people who think fans will buy anything with the words Sword Art Online on it. And the title alone already sounds tired. Echoes of Aincrad? Really? This again? That arc has been dragged out so many times that it feels like a broken record. It is the same setting, the same idea, the same nostalgia bait over and over. It feels like the developers ran out of ideas years ago and never bothered to come up with new ones. The early footage does not help either. The combat looks stiff. The animations look clumsy. The world looks empty and dull. Nothing about it stands out. Nothing about it looks fun. It just sits there looking like a low-effort project that hopes fans will not notice how little work went into it. And the worst part is that this will probably still sell. Not because it is good. Not because people actually asked for it. It will sell because the name is familiar, and some fans will buy anything tied to that series. That is the sad truth. When companies know they can get away with this, they stop trying. So now there is another Sword Art Online game on the way, and it already feels like a waste of time. Instead of doing something fresh or interesting, they went back to the same old place with the same tired idea. It is dull, lazy, and completely unnecessary. No one asked for this, yet somehow we are stuck with it anyway. The funniest part is that the game does not even seem to have much to do with the actual anime. It is like they just borrowed the setting and called it a day. They grabbed the names, threw a few familiar characters on screen, and then made up some random story that has nothing to do with what the series is actually about. Just watch the official trailer. They go on and on about how the world is in danger and how some god of death is going to be resurrected. And then they start talking about destroying something called the core of life to save the world. It sounds like some generic fantasy plot that could belong to literally any game. Nothing about it feels like Sword Art Online. That is the problem. That is not what the anime is about. The whole point of the story is simple. 10,000 people are trapped inside a virtual world. If they die in the game, they die in real life. The only way out is to clear 100 floors. It is a survival story about people trying to escape a nightmare. There is no god of death coming back. There is no magical world-ending object that needs to be destroyed. There is no epic save-the-universe quest. It is a death game. People are trapped. People are scared. People are trying not to die while they fight their way out. But this game throws all of that away and replaces it with some loud, dramatic nonsense that has nothing to do with the original idea. It feels like the developers barely understood the story they were borrowing from. They saw a floating castle, called it the same thing as in the anime, and thought that was enough. The actual concept of the series did not matter to them. So instead of a tense story about being stuck in a death game, we get some random plot about a resurrected death god and a mysterious core of life. It is not clever. It is not interesting. It is just generic fantasy garbage wearing a Sword Art Online costume, and it looks as lazy as it sounds. Most of the monsters the players fight are not even from the anime either. They are just making things up. If you look at the enemies shown so far, most of them do not look familiar at all. They are not creatures people remember from the show. They look like random fantasy monsters that could come from any low-effort role-playing game. That says a lot. Instead of using enemies that people actually saw in the series, they just fill the game with whatever nonsense they feel like adding. Giant beasts, strange demons, random creatures with glowing parts and spikes everywhere. None of it feels tied to the world that the anime showed. It feels like a pile of generic monsters thrown together to fill space. And the reason is obvious. The original anime is so weak and so thin that there is barely anything there to work with. The story jumps around. Huge parts are skipped. Most of the floors are never shown. The world sounds big, but it is mostly empty when you actually look at it. So now the game developers have to make things up just to keep the game from feeling hollow. They have to invent new enemies. They have to invent new story elements. They have to invent random threats and bosses that never existed in the anime. Otherwise, there would be nothing to fight and nothing to do. That is the problem when the original material is this thin. It sounds large and exciting on the surface, but when someone tries to build an actual game around it, the gaps become obvious. There is not enough detail. There is not enough depth. There is not enough substance. So the developers patched those holes with random ideas and generic monsters. And the result does not feel like Sword Art Online. It just feels like another bland fantasy game that borrowed a famous setting because the name might help it sell. The more you look at it, the more it feels like a cheap imitation of something that was already weak to begin with. The armor and weapons are also almost completely unrecognizable. They do not resemble the anime at all. The designs look nothing like what people actually remember from the series. If you showed some of this gear to a fan with no context, they probably would not even guess it was supposed to be from Sword Art Online. The equipment in the show had a pretty clear and basic look. But the stuff in this game looks like it came from some completely different project. Over-designed outfits that look more like costumes than gear someone would use in a fight. It does not match the tone of the series at all. It feels like the developers thought the original designs were too plain, so they tried to make everything louder and more dramatic. Bigger weapons, more glowing parts. More pointless details thrown everywhere. The result just looks messy and generic. And once again, it makes the game feel disconnected from the source material. The world is supposed to be the same as the show, but the equipment does not look like it belongs there. The characters are supposed to be part of that setting, yet they are running around with gear that looks like it came from a completely different fantasy game. It is another sign that the developers either did not understand the look of the series or simply did not care. Instead of sticking to the style that people actually recognize, they replaced it with random designs that feel cheap and overdone. So now even the armor and weapons fail to feel like Sword Art Online. They just look like generic fantasy gear with the name of the series slapped on top. And the more you notice these details, the harder it is to take the game seriously. It is also hilarious that this is apparently a single-player game. Think about how ridiculous that is for a second. The entire point of Sword Art Online was that it took place inside a massive online game. An MMORPG, that means thousands of players in the same world at the same time. That was the core idea from the very beginning. The whole story depends on that. 10,000 people trapped inside the same game. Guilds forming. Groups fighting bosses together. Players helping each other survive. Others turning on each other. A huge crowd of people stuck in the same nightmare. That is the foundation of the entire setting. And yet this new game throws that away and turns it into a single-player experience. Just you running around while the rest of the world is filled with lifeless computer-controlled characters. The setting is supposed to be full of real players, but instead you get a quiet, empty world where everything revolves around one person. It completely misses the point. It feels like they looked at the basic idea of Sword Art Online and decided it was too much work to actually recreate it. Making a real MMO would take effort. It would take servers, systems, balance, and real support. It would take time and money. So instead they went with the easiest option possible. Just make another basic single-player action game and pretend it fits the setting. So now the series that is famous for being about a massive online game somehow ends up with a single-player game instead? No real players. No real community. No real sense that thousands of people are trapped in the same world together. It is lazy. It is backwards. And it shows exactly how little effort they are willing to put into this thing. If you cannot even bother to match the most basic idea of the series you are adapting, then what is the point of making the game at all? Or maybe there is another reason. Maybe they know that Sword Art Online would make a terrible MMO if someone actually tried to build it for real. Because once you stop and think about it, the game design in that series is awful. The show tries to present it like this amazing virtual world, but the more you look at it, the more it falls apart. The system does not make any sense. Balance is all over the place. One player can somehow become absurdly stronger than everyone else for no clear reason. Skills appear and disappear whenever the story feels like it. Rare items drop in ways that feel completely random. None of it feels like a well-designed online game. The boss fights are not much better either. The story acts like these are massive coordinated battles, but the way they are shown makes them look chaotic and poorly planned. There is no clear structure. No obvious mechanics. Just a crowd of people swinging weapons and hoping they do not die. And the economy barely seems to exist. The world is supposed to have thousands of players, yet the systems around crafting, trading, and resources are barely explained. It feels less like a real MMO and more like a vague fantasy world that happens to have menus. So maybe the developers know the truth. If they actually tried to turn Sword Art Online into a real MMO, people would quickly see how badly designed it is. Players would pick it apart in days. The balance would be a mess. The systems would feel shallow. The whole thing would collapse under real scrutiny. It is much easier to hide those problems in a single-player game. Computer-controlled party members do not complain. Fake players do not question bad mechanics. The game can push the player through a scripted story and pretend everything works. In other words, making a real MMO might expose how poorly thought out the original game design really is. And that is probably the last thing they want people to notice. It also seems like the game is only coming out on PlayStation, Xbox, and Steam. Not even virtual reality. That alone is a huge missed opportunity. Think about it for a moment. The whole story is built around the idea of total immersion. Players are not just looking at a screen. They are inside the game. They move, fight, and explore as if they are really there. That sounds like the perfect setup for a virtual reality game. If there was ever a series that should try to take advantage of VR, it is this one. Walking through Sword Art Online. Looking up at the massive floating floors above you. Standing face to face with a boss monster. Fighting with your own movements instead of pressing buttons on a controller. That would actually feel close to the idea the series is built on, but they did not even try. Instead, it looks like they went with the most basic option possible. A normal game on a normal console, played on a normal screen with a normal controller. Nothing about that captures the feeling the series is supposed to have. It just turns the whole thing into another standard action game that happens to use the Sword Art Online name. It feels like such an obvious thing to attempt, yet they completely ignored it. It would give players some sense of being inside the world instead of just watching it from the outside. But that would take effort. It would take extra development time. It would take more planning and more resources. And once again, it looks like the developers chose the easier and quicker path. So now we have a series that is famous for being about living inside a virtual game world. And the new game adaptation does not even bother trying to use the closest real technology we have to that idea. It is another example of how little ambition this project seems to have. They had a perfect chance to do something interesting, and they completely wasted it. And to make it even worse, the game apparently only takes place on the first and second floor. Just the first 2 out of 100? Think about how ridiculous that is. The entire idea of Sword Art Online is that it is set in a massive game with 100 different floors, each with its own environment, monsters, towns, and challenges. The whole point of the story is climbing higher and higher while trying to clear every floor and escape. That structure is what makes the world interesting. And yet this game only uses the first and second floor, 2 floors out of 100. Instead of trying to build a large world that actually reflects the scale of Sword Art Online, they stopped almost immediately. So they just did the bare minimum. And that completely kills the sense of progress that the setting is supposed to have. Climbing the floors is meant to feel like a huge journey. Each floor cleared is supposed to feel like a step closer to freedom. The environments are supposed to change as you move upward. But if the game only covers 2 floors, that entire concept disappears. There is no real climb. There is no long journey. It just feels small and limited. It also raises an obvious question. What exactly are players supposed to do for the rest of the game? Are they just going to run around the same 2 floors over and over again, fighting the same monsters and repeating the same activities? Because that does not sound exciting. That sounds repetitive and lazy. Once again, it feels like they took a big idea and shrank it down to the smallest version possible. The game of Sword Art Online is supposed to be enormous. 100 floors full of different areas and challenges. But this game reduces that massive setting to 2 small sections. And the reason is pretty obvious. Building 100 unique floors would take a lot of time and effort. So instead of even trying, they cut almost the entire thing. Which just makes the project feel even more cheap and unfinished. It would be like if MrBeast made his Big Squid Game challenge video, but only included the first 2 games. Imagine all the hype around that video, all the promotion, millions of people waiting to see it, and then the contestants only play the first 2 challenges before the whole thing just stops. Each game raises the tension and moves the competition forward. Skipping most of them would make the whole thing feel unfinished and pointless. It would feel like someone gave up halfway through. That is exactly the same kind of feeling this game creates. The game is supposed to have 100 floors. The whole journey is about climbing through them, fighting bosses, and slowly getting closer to the top. That structure is the backbone of the entire setting. But this game only uses the first and second floor. So it is like announcing this huge adventure through a massive game and then barely stepping inside before stopping. Just like the MrBeast Squid Game video would feel incomplete if it only showed 2 challenges, this game feels incomplete because it barely touches the world it is supposed to be based on. It gives the impression that the developers simply did not want to put in the effort. Building a full game with many different floors would take time, planning, and creativity. Instead, they stopped almost immediately and tried to stretch those first two areas into an entire game. That is why it feels so lazy. The concept they are working with is massive, but the portion they actually built is tiny. And when you compare the scale of the idea to what they actually delivered, the lack of effort becomes painfully obvious. They're also trying way too hard to hype this game up, and it just makes the whole thing look even more pathetic. The marketing keeps pushing this dramatic line about how every battle could be your last. They say it like it is supposed to sound intense and dangerous. But that line only works in the show. In the story of Sword Art Online, if you die in the game, you die in real life. That is the entire reason the fights matter so much. Every boss fight is terrifying because the players know they only get one chance. One mistake means they are gone for good. That is where the tension comes from. This game does not have that. There is no real fear. It is just another standard video game where failure means waiting a few seconds and starting over. So when the marketing says every battle could be your last, it sounds ridiculous. No, it cannot. The player will just respawn and keep going like in every other game. The line is empty. It has no weight at all. It feels like the marketing team is trying to copy the tone of the anime without understanding why it worked there. They want the drama, they want the tension, they want the feeling of danger. But they cannot actually recreate it, because this is just a normal single-player game, so the line ends up sounding fake. It is loud and dramatic, but completely hollow. It is like someone shouting about life and death stakes in a situation where nothing serious is actually happening. Instead of building real tension through gameplay, they just throw out big dramatic lines and hope nobody thinks about them for more than a few seconds. The moment you do think about it, the whole thing falls apart. And this brings up an obvious question. How exactly is a battle supposed to be your last one? What does that even mean in a normal video game? Does the game end forever if you die? Do they lock you out and delete your save the moment you lose a fight? Because if they do not, then the whole line falls apart immediately. Players will just reload and try again. That is how games work. You fail, you restart, and you keep going until you win. So where's the danger supposed to come from? If you lose a fight and the game just sends you back to a checkpoint, then that battle clearly was not your last one. It was just a minor setback that costs you a few minutes. There's no tension there. There's no real consequence. The player knows they can keep trying as many times as they want. And even if the developers tried to be dramatic and actually end the game when you die, that still would not mean much. Players could just start a new save file and go again. The game would still be sitting right there on their system. In fact, even if they somehow locked the entire game after one death, someone could just buy another copy and start over. The idea still would not carry the same weight as the story in the show. In the anime, death means you are gone in real life. There is no second chance. There's no reset button. That is what makes every fight terrifying. A normal video game cannot recreate that. The player is sitting safely on a couch with a controller. The worst thing that can happen is losing some progress and having to repeat a section. That is not life or death. That is just a minor inconvenience. So when the marketing keeps shouting that every battle could be your last, it ends up sounding silly. It is false advertising. The moment you think about it for even a few seconds, the whole idea collapses. It is empty drama for a situation that does not actually have any real stakes. Apparently, they are including a 110-minute promotional film for people who buy the game. That alone says a lot about how little confidence they seem to have in the actual product. Think about how strange that is. This is supposed to be a video game. The thing people are buying should be the game itself. The gameplay should be the main attraction. The story, the combat, the world. That is what should convince people to buy it. But instead, they feel the need to attach a long promotional film as a bonus. 110 minutes. That is almost 2 hours. At that point, it is basically a full movie being used as bait to get people to open their wallets. It makes it look like the developers and publishers know the game cannot stand on its own. If the game was truly impressive, they would not need to distract people with extra material. Instead, they are dangling a film in front of fans like a shiny object. It feels less like a reward and more like a desperate attempt to pad the value of the purchase. As if they are saying, please buy this. Look, you also get a long video with it. That is not confidence, that is marketing panic. And it is not hard to see what they are aiming for. They know there are fans who will buy anything connected to the series. So they stack extra content on top of the game to make the package look bigger than it really is. The game might be weak, but if they throw in a film, some bonus scenes, and a few other extras, maybe people will convince themselves it is worth the money. It is a classic move. When the main product is not strong enough, pile on bonus material and hope nobody notices. Instead of improving the game itself, they try to make the box look more appealing, which just makes the whole thing feel even more like a cash grab. The game alone should be enough. The fact that they feel the need to bundle something like that with it just makes the situation look even more desperate. And the funniest part is that the whole plan will fail anyway. That 110-minute film they are using as bait is almost certainly going to get leaked. That is how the internet works now. The moment something like that is released, someone will record it, upload it, and spread it around. So people who did not buy the game are still going to watch it. All it takes is one person to upload the video somewhere. After that, it spreads everywhere. Clips show up on video sites. Full recordings get shared on random file sites. People pass it around in forums and chat groups. Anyone who actually wants to see it will be able to find it in a few minutes. Which makes the whole strategy look even more pointless. They are acting like this film is some special reward that only buyers will get to experience. But in reality, it will not stay exclusive for long. Once it is out in the world, it will be copied and shared over and over again. The people who are curious about the film will still watch it, even if they never spend a single dollar on the game. So now you have this strange situation where the film is supposed to help sell the game, but it will probably just end up floating around online for free anyway. People who were already planning to buy the game will buy it. People who were not interested will just wait for the video to appear somewhere else. That means the extra bonus does not really solve anything. It does not make the game better. It does not fix the weak marketing. It just becomes another piece of content that eventually escapes the box and spreads across the internet. Which once again makes the whole thing feel like a cheap attempt to attract attention. Instead of putting all their effort into making a strong game, they are throwing in a long promotional film and hoping that will impress people. But even that is not likely to stay locked behind the purchase for very long. Anyone who is curious enough will still see it without buying the game. And of course, they are also doing the usual pre-order nonsense. People who pre-order the game get a special weapon pack. Because apparently that is the trick they think will convince people to buy it early. It just makes the whole thing look even more desperate. If the game was actually strong on its own, they would not need to wave extra items in front of people to push pre-orders. The gameplay footage should be enough. The story should be enough. The world should be enough. Players should look at the game and think it is worth buying without being bribed with bonus equipment. But instead they are dangling a pack of weapons as a reward for buying the game before it even comes out. And what does that really mean? Either those weapons are strong, which makes the start of the game unbalanced for anyone who has them, or they are weak, which means the reward is pointless and forgettable. Either way, it does not add anything meaningful. It also sends a bad message. That has nothing to do with skill or progress in the game world. It is just a marketing trick. And it is such an overused one too. Pre-order bonuses have been around for years, and they almost always feel the same. A few extra weapons, maybe some armor, sometimes a cosmetic item. Things that exist purely to pressure people into buying before they even know if the game is good. So now, on top of the weak trailers, the dramatic taglines that mean nothing, the random story that has nothing to do with the anime, and the extra film being used as bait, they are also throwing in pre-order weapon packs. It just piles on more signs that they are trying to force excitement instead of earning it. When a game needs this many little tricks to attract attention, it usually means the game itself is not strong enough to do the job. And the more they keep adding these desperate incentives, the more obvious that becomes. The pricing is also completely ridiculous. The most expensive edition of the game costs $150. $150. For this, who exactly do they think is going to pay that? That is an absurd amount of money for a single game, especially one that already looks this weak. When a company charges that much, you would expect something truly impressive. A massive game, incredible production quality. Something that clearly took a lot of effort to create. But this does not look like that at all. From what has been shown so far, it looks like a fairly standard action game with a messy story, random monsters, and a bunch of bonus junk thrown in to make the package look bigger. And somehow they expect people to hand over $150 for the top edition. It feels like they are just pushing the price higher and higher. Because they know there will always be a small group of fans willing to pay it. Not because the game deserves that price, but because the name on the box is enough for some people. And of course, the expensive edition is probably filled with the usual extras that barely matter. Some digital items, a few cosmetic pieces, maybe the promotional film they keep advertising. None of that justifies such a massive price tag. At the end of the day, it is still the same game underneath. So the question remains, who is actually going to look at this game, see that $150 price tag, and think it is worth it? For a series that already has so many problems, charging that much just makes the whole thing look even more greedy. It feels less like they are trying to sell a great game and more like they are trying to squeeze as much money as possible out of the people who still care about the brand. At this point, you would have to pay me to play this game. I am not paying them a single dollar to touch it. The idea of spending money on something that already looks this bad is ridiculous. They are the ones asking for $150 for the top edition, as if this is some huge must-play experience. But based on everything that has been shown so far, it looks like the exact opposite. Weak gameplay, a story that has nothing to do with the anime, random monsters, strange equipment designs, desperate marketing, and a pile of bonus junk used to distract from the actual product. And they expect people to pay for that. No, if anything, the situation should be reversed. If they really want people to spend time with this thing, they should be the ones offering compensation. Sitting through a long, dull game like this sounds more like a chore than entertainment. It is supposed to be fun. That is the entire point of a video game. People pay money because they expect an enjoyable experience. But when a game looks this uninspired and this poorly thought out, it stops feeling like something worth buying. So the idea of handing over money for it just sounds absurd. The only way I would consider playing something that looks this bad is if someone else was paying me for the trouble. Otherwise, it is not even worth the time, let alone the price they are asking. And when you compare the price to other games, it looks even worse. A whole year of membership for RuneScape is less than $100. That is 12 full months of access to a huge online world that people can play every day. Think about the difference there. For about $100, RuneScape gives you an enormous game with a massive map, dozens of skills to train, hundreds of quests, bosses, minigames, player trading, and a real online community with thousands of people playing at the same time. The game has been expanding for years. New content keeps getting added. There is always something else to do, and that costs less than this $150 edition of the game. So what exactly are you getting for the extra $50 here? One single-player game that you will probably finish once and then never touch again. A few bonus items. A promotional film. Maybe some cosmetics that barely matter? That is it. Meanwhile, RuneScape gives players a living world with a ridiculous amount of content that can easily last hundreds or even thousands of hours. People spend years playing that game because there's always another goal, another skill to train, another quest to complete. So paying $100 for a year of something that big actually makes sense. You are paying for a huge amount of entertainment spread across an entire year. But paying $150 for this sword art online game? That just looks like a bad joke. The scale is not even close. The amount of content is not even close. The value is not even close. One is a massive online game that has been built and expanded for decades. When you put the two next to each other, the price of this game looks even more ridiculous than it already did. And on top of that, RuneScape even has a free option. You do not have to pay anything just to try it out. Anyone can download it, log in, and start playing without spending a single dollar. If they like it, they can upgrade later. If they do not like it, they can simply stop playing. There is no risk. That alone makes it far more reasonable. And RuneScape is not the only one that does this. A lot of online games give players some kind of free entry point. They let people test the game first before asking for money. That makes sense. It shows confidence in the product. If the game is actually fun, people will eventually be willing to pay for extra features or expansions. But this Sword Art Online game is doing the exact opposite. Instead of letting people try it and see if they like it, they're asking for up to $150 right away. That is a massive price tag for something that already looks questionable. They want people to commit their money before they even know if the game is any good. And when you compare that to the other options out there, it just looks worse and worse. There are huge games that people can try for free. Games with massive worlds, tons of content, and years of updates behind them. Even many paid games cost far less than $150 and still offer far more value. So the question becomes obvious. Why would anyone spend that much money on something that already looks weak when there are so many better alternatives? You could spend less money on games that are bigger, more polished, and actually respected by players. Or you could even play some games for free and decide later if they are worth supporting. But somehow this project expects people to hand over $150 for what looks like a garbage tie-in game with a messy story and very little content. When you look at the wider gaming market, that price does not just look high, it looks completely absurd. There are simply too many better options out there for something like this to justify that kind of cost. I honestly have no idea why they thought making another game based on Sword Art Online was a good idea. The series itself is a complete disaster. The writing is messy. The story jumps all over the place. Characters appear and disappear without much purpose. Huge parts of the world are skipped or barely explained. It feels like a concept that sounded interesting at first, but was never handled very well. And the problems only get worse the longer the series goes on. The early idea of people trapped in a deadly game could have been interesting if it was explored properly. Instead, it rushes through floors, skips huge events, and drops plot points whenever it feels like it. The pacing is a mess. The tension disappears. By the time it moves on to other arcs, the whole thing just feels confused. The fanbase does not help either. A lot of it is loud, defensive, and willing to praise almost anything connected to the series, no matter how weak it is. That kind of environment makes it easy for companies to keep pumping out garbage products. They know there will always be a group of people ready to defend it and buy it anyway. So the series keeps getting more games, more tie-in content, more projects that feel rushed or unnecessary. Instead of slowing down and trying to improve the quality, they just keep pushing out more material because the name still gets attention. And the overall direction of the series has not exactly been getting better. If anything, it feels like it has been going downhill for a while. The original idea has been stretched so thin that it barely resembles what made people curious about it in the first place. New arcs pile on more random concepts instead of fixing the old problems, which makes this new game feel even more pointless. Instead of taking the time to rethink things or create something better, they just keep recycling the same name and hoping people will keep buying. At some point, it stops feeling like genuine interest in the series and starts looking like simple brand exploitation. The name still has recognition, so they keep using it. Even if the show itself is messy, even if the quality keeps slipping, and even if the new projects look weak from the start, the franchise also does not have a good track record when it comes to games. I have never played any of the Sword Art Online games myself, but it does not take much effort to see how they have been received. Just look at reviews and discussions from people who actually played them. The pattern is pretty obvious. Almost every time a new Sword Art Online game comes out, the reaction is the same. People say the combat is clunky, the story feels like filler, the gameplay gets repetitive very quickly, the worlds feel empty. The games end up looking like low-effort tie-in projects that exist mainly to cash in on the name. You see the same complaints again and again: weak graphics, strange mechanics, long sections of boring dialogue, lots of grinding that does not feel rewarding. It always sounds like the developers are trying to stretch a thin idea into a full game. And when the same problems keep showing up across multiple releases, it starts to look like a pattern instead of a one-time mistake. It suggests that the games are not being treated like serious projects. They feel more like quick spin-offs meant to grab money from fans who want anything related to the series. That history makes it even harder to take this new game seriously. When a franchise already has a reputation for weak games, people are naturally going to be skeptical of the next one. The burden is on the developers to prove that this time will be different. But from what has been shown so far, this game does not look like some big improvement. It looks like more of the same problems. Another bad action game using the Sword Art Online name to attract attention. So when you combine that history with everything else that has been shown, it does not exactly inspire confidence. Instead, it just looks like the next entry in a long list of forgettable tie-in games. Even the developer name does not inspire much confidence. That has to be one of the most boring and unoriginal names imaginable. Seriously, Game Studio. It is the kind of label you would expect to see in a rough draft or a test project. Not the official name of the company making a full commercial release. Most developers at least try to come up with something that stands out. Something with a bit of personality. Something that people might actually remember. But this just sounds like the most basic description possible. And it almost feels fitting when you look at the rest of the project. The story looks generic. The monsters look generic. The equipment designs look generic. So of course the developer name ends up sounding just as bland. It does not exactly make you confident in the creativity behind their games. It just adds one more small detail that makes the whole thing feel dull and uninspired. Everything about this project gives off the same impression. No imagination. No effort to stand out. Even the name of the developer fits that pattern perfectly. And when you look at the rest of the games this developer has made, it does not exactly improve the situation. Most of their past work is just trashy mobile games, repetitive gameplay, a lot of grinding, plenty of cheap tricks to get players to spend extra money. That kind of background does not exactly make people confident about a full console release. Making a small mobile game is very different from building a large, polished game for PlayStation or Xbox. It requires more planning. But if most of the experience of the studio comes from pumping out basic phone games, it raises some obvious concerns. Are they really prepared to handle something bigger? It also makes the whole thing feel even more like a cash grab. Mobile games are often built around quick profits and low-effort design. When a studio with that kind of history suddenly appears with a big licensed project, it does not exactly scream quality. Instead, it makes the game look like another product built to squeeze money out of a well-known name. Take a popular franchise, hand it to a developer that usually makes cheap mobile titles, and hope fans buy it anyway. So between the weak-looking trailers, the strange story, the overpriced editions, and the history of the developer with low-effort phone games, it is not hard to see why people would be skeptical. Nothing about that combination suggests a high-quality game. If anything, it suggests the exact opposite. Even the title of the game sounds stupid. What is it supposed to mean? It feels like one of those names that tries way too hard to sound cool and dramatic, but ends up sounding empty instead. Echoes of what exactly? That word gets thrown around a lot in titles because it sounds mysterious, but most of the time it does not actually say anything meaningful. It is just vague noise. Adding echoes of in front of it does not really explain anything about the game. It does not tell you what the story is about. It does not hint at the gameplay. It does not even describe the conflict. It just sits there trying to sound edgy. Instead of using a clear name that actually describes the game, they stack dramatic-sounding words together and hope people think it sounds deep. Words like echoes, shadows, awakening, or rebirth. They show up everywhere because they sound serious without having to explain anything. That is exactly what this feels like. It sounds like someone sat in a meeting room trying to come up with something that felt intense and mysterious. And the result is a title that sounds forced and meaningless. Sounding phrase that feels like it was designed by a marketing team trying too hard to look cool. It is another small detail, but it fits perfectly with everything else about the project. Trying to look impressive on the surface while having very little substance behind it. Overall, nothing about this looks good. Not the gameplay, not the story, not the designs, not the marketing, not the price, and not the developer behind it. Every time you look at another part of this project, it just gives you another reason to doubt it. The story looks like random fantasy nonsense that has nothing to do with the original premise. The monsters and equipment do not even resemble what people remember from the series. The dramatic marketing lines fall apart the moment you think about them. The game is single-player even though the entire idea of the series revolves around a massive online world. The price is absurd. The developer mostly makes cheap mobile games. None of this builds confidence. Instead, it all adds up to the same conclusion. This looks like another low-effort tie-in project that exists mainly to squeeze money out of a well-known name. So honestly, the best advice is simple. Just avoid it. There are so many better games out there that actually deserve your time and money. Games made by developers who care about what they are building. Games with real effort behind them. Games that offer interesting ideas, polished mechanics, and worlds that are actually fun to explore. Why waste time on something that already looks this weak? Instead of throwing money at a lazy project like this, spend it on games that are actually good. There are plenty of them. Games that will give you hours of enjoyment instead of leaving you wondering why you bothered in the first place. Your time and your money are both valuable. There is no reason to spend either one on something that already looks like a disappointment. Honestly, the best thing that could happen is for this game to flop. Let it fail, let it sell poorly, let it fade away. Because if it somehow succeeds, it will just encourage them to keep making more trash like this. That is how this industry works. When something sells well, companies see it as proof that the formula works. They do not stop and ask if the product was actually good. They just look at the sales numbers. If the numbers are high, they keep doing the same thing again and again. So if a weak game like this ends up making a lot of money, what happens next? More games like it. More rushed tie-ins. More overpriced editions filled with pointless extras. More lazy projects that rely on a familiar name instead of real quality. The cycle just continues. But if the game fails, that sends a message. It shows that people are not interested in low-effort cash grabs. It shows that fans are not willing to keep throwing money at anything with a famous title slapped on the cover. Companies notice when something loses money. And when something loses money, they start to rethink what they are doing. Maybe that means they stop making games for this series altogether. Maybe it forces them to actually improve the quality if they ever try again. Either way, it is better than rewarding a weak product with strong sales. So letting this game flop might be the best outcome. If people stop buying these kinds of projects, companies eventually get the hint. And maybe then they will stop pushing out this kind of lazy garbage and start putting real effort into the games they make. Honestly, it would not surprise me if this was never even meant to be a Sword Art Online game in the first place. It feels more like a generic fantasy game that had the Sword Art Online label slapped onto it later. When you look at everything shown so far, very little of it actually feels tied to the series. The story is about some random death god being resurrected and destroying a core of life. That has nothing to do with the original premise. The monsters are mostly random creatures that were never in the show. The armor and weapons look completely different from what the anime used. Even the gameplay just looks like a standard fantasy action game. Nothing about it screams Sword Art Online. That makes it feel like the developers already had a basic fantasy game in progress. A world with monsters, swords, and a simple quest about saving the world. The kind of generic setup that has been done 1,000 times before. And then at some point someone probably realized that a random fantasy game like that would not get much attention. There are too many of them already. Another one would just blend into the background and nobody would care. So what is the easiest solution? Attach a well-known name to it. A few familiar characters are added. Some references get thrown into the dialogue. The marketing starts using the Sword Art Online brand. Now the same basic game suddenly has a recognizable label that can attract fans. It is a quick way to create buzz without actually building something new. That would explain why so many parts of the game feel disconnected from the series. Because the foundation was probably never designed around Sword Art Online in the first place. It was just a generic fantasy project that got dressed up to look like one. And if that is the case, it makes the whole thing feel even more cynical. Instead of carefully adapting the world and ideas of the series, they might have just taken an unrelated game and forced it into that shape so it could sell better. Which would explain why so much of it looks and feels completely off. I honestly feel bad for the people who are going to fall for this gimmick and buy it. Not because they deserve it, but because they are probably going to realize later that they wasted their money. The marketing is clearly designed to pull people in with big dramatic trailers, flashy scenes, and a familiar name. Some people are going to see that, get excited, and assume the game must be good. They will pre-order it, buy the expensive edition, and convince themselves that it will be worth it. Then they will actually sit down and play it. And that is when the disappointment usually hits. When the flashy trailer turns into repetitive gameplay. When the dramatic story turns into a bunch of generic nonsense. When the big, exciting world turns out to be small and empty. At that point, the money is already gone. That is the worst part about games like this. They might play for a few hours hoping it gets better, only to realize that it does not. Eventually they stop playing and move on, but the purchase still feels like a mistake. And it happens every time with these kinds of projects. A well-known name creates hype. Some people get caught up in it. They buy the game before realizing what they are actually getting. Then the regret comes later. That is why it is better to step back and look at things carefully instead of jumping in because of marketing. When a game already shows this many warning signs, it is usually not a good idea to ignore them. Otherwise, people end up learning the hard way after their money is already spent. If it has not been abundantly clear already, I will not be playing this game. Not now, not later, not when it goes on sale, not ever. I have never played any Sword Art Online game before, and this one certainly is not going to be the thing that changes that. Nothing about it looks appealing. Nothing about it makes me curious. If anything, everything that has been shown pushes me further in the opposite direction. And that is the thing. The whole marketing push around this game is clearly built on hype. Big dramatic trailers. Loud taglines. Expensive editions filled with extras. Pre-order bonuses. A promotional film. All of it is designed to make the game seem bigger and more exciting than it actually is. But hype only works if people fall for it. I am not buying into that. I am not going to see a flashy trailer and suddenly forget about all the problems that are already obvious. The weak-looking gameplay, the strange story, the tiny portion of the actual floors being used, the ridiculous price, the developer's history with low-effort games. None of that magically disappears just because the marketing team tries to make the game look exciting. So no, I am not interested. I skipped every other Sword Art Online game that came out before this, and from the looks of it, that was the right decision. There is no reason to suddenly jump in now when this one looks just as bad, if not worse. At the end of the day, it is simple. I am not getting caught up in the hype, and I am not getting fooled by flashy marketing. I am not going to waste my money, and I am definitely not going to waste my time. If anything, this game just reinforces the decision I already made a long time ago. Stay away from these games and spend that time on something that is actually worth playing. I will not be deceived by this one, not even close. I am not a fan of Sword Art Online. I never was, and I never will be. The series never impressed me from the start, and nothing it has done since then has changed my mind. If anything, everything I have seen over the years has only reinforced that opinion. So the idea that I would suddenly get excited for a game based on it is ridiculous. I am not interested in the game. I am not interested in the story it is trying to tell. I am not interested in the world it is trying to recreate. None of it appeals to me. The only thing I find interesting about the whole situation is pointing out how much of a mess it all is. The show itself has so many problems that it practically invites criticism. The rushed story, the inconsistent writing, the wasted ideas, the constant attempts to stretch the concept into more arcs and more content even when it clearly ran out of direction. It feels like something that had one decent idea at the beginning and then stumbled through everything that came after. And the fanbase does not exactly make things better. There are plenty of people who defend the series no matter what, even when the flaws are obvious. That kind of blind loyalty only encourages more low-effort projects to keep appearing. So if anything, the only part of this whole situation that holds any appeal is analyzing it and ripping it apart piece by piece. Looking at the show, the spin-off games, the marketing, and all the strange decisions surrounding them, and pointing out just how poorly it all holds together. Because when you step back and actually examine it, there is a lot to criticize. But actually playing the game? No, that is not happening. I have no interest in supporting it, no interest in spending money on it, and no interest in pretending it looks better than it does. If anything, it just looks like another example of the same problems that have followed the series for years. You can also bet that when I eventually get my hands on that bonus anime film, I am going to rip it apart. There is no way I am going to watch something like that and just sit there quietly. If anything, it will probably give even more material to criticize. Because if the game itself is already showing this many problems, there is a good chance the film will have plenty of issues as well. Promotional films like that are usually made to hype things up, not to actually tell a strong story. They are full of dramatic scenes, loud music, and big moments that are supposed to impress the audience. But when you slow down and actually look at them, a lot of those scenes fall apart. The writing tends to be weak. The logic of the story often makes no sense. Characters behave in strange ways just to push the plot forward. The film might try to sound deep or emotional, but once you start examining it closely, the cracks start to show. And that is exactly what I would plan to do. If I watch it, I am not just going to sit there and accept everything it throws out. I would go through it carefully and point out every mistake, every lazy plot point, every moment where the writing falls apart. If the film tries to present itself as something impressive, then it should be ready to be examined just as closely. That is the risk of putting something like this out in public. Once it exists, people are free to analyze it and criticize it. So if the film ends up being as messy as the game already looks, it will probably just add another long list of problems to talk about. And given everything else surrounding this project, there is a good chance there will be plenty of material to work with. That is the end of this video. But do not worry. This is far from the end of the criticism. There is still plenty more Sword Art Online nonsense out there to talk about and plenty more problems to rip apart. Because the strange thing about this franchise is that it just keeps going. No matter how many issues people point out, no matter how many weak projects come out, the series keeps finding new ways to show up again. Another arc. Another spin-off. Another game. Another attempt to keep the name alive. And every time it happens, it creates more material to examine and criticize. So if you thought this was the last time you were going to hear complaints about Sword Art Online, think again. There is still a long list of things that deserve to be picked apart. The show itself, the games, the strange marketing decisions, the fan reactions, and whatever new project they decide to push out next. There is always something new to look at. In other words, the nightmare never really ends. As long as this franchise keeps releasing new content, there will always be more to analyze and more to criticize. So this might be the end of this video. But it is definitely not the end of the discussion. There is plenty more Sword Art Online criticism coming your way. And judging by how things keep going with this series, there will probably never be a shortage of things to talk about. I am sure the fans of Sword Art Online are going to be angry about this video. That always seems to happen whenever someone criticizes their beloved franchise. The moment you start pointing out the problems, some people immediately get defensive and act like you committed some kind of crime just for having a negative opinion. But honestly, I do not care at all. That is their problem, not mine. People are allowed to dislike things. Not everyone is going to praise the same series or pretend that every new project attached to it is amazing. And this franchise especially gives people plenty of reasons to criticize it. So if some fans get mad about hearing harsh opinions, they can stay mad. Getting angry does not magically make the criticism disappear, and it definitely does not make the problems go away. All it does is show that some people would rather defend the series than actually listen to what is being said. At the end of the day, this is just an opinion about a show and a game. If people cannot handle that, then they probably should not be watching videos that openly criticize them in the first place. I am still going to say exactly what I think, whether some fans like it or not. Fans of Sword Art Online are free to leave all the angry comments they want. If someone feels the need to write a long rant defending the series or complaining about this video, they can go right ahead. The comment section is there for people to say whatever they want. It just does not matter to me. The truth is, I do not even read the comments to begin with. I am not sitting there scrolling through them, looking for reactions or arguing with people all day. That is not something I spend time on. So if someone thinks they are going to change my mind or somehow win an argument in the comments, they are wasting their energy. They can type out paragraphs about why they think the series is amazing. They can complain about the criticism. They can call the video unfair or say I do not understand the franchise. None of that is going to affect anything, because I am not reading it. So if fans of Sword Art Online want to flood the comment section with angry messages, they can go ahead and do that. It will not change the criticism, and it definitely will not make me suddenly like the series. All it will do is sit there in a comment section that I do not even bother to look at. And if fans of Sword Art Online rush into the comments to complain, they would only be proving my point about the hypocrisy. They say things like, just stop watching, or just ignore the hate. But the moment someone actually criticizes the series, that advice suddenly disappears. Instead of ignoring it, some fans feel the need to jump into the comments and argue about it. They start writing long messages defending the franchise, complaining about the criticism, or telling the creator they are wrong. In other words, they are doing the exact opposite of the advice they like to give everyone else. If someone is taking the time to comment on a video criticizing the series, then they clearly are not ignoring it. They are paying attention to it. They are reacting to it. They are getting involved in it. That alone shows that the just ignore the hate argument only seems to apply when it is convenient. Because if they truly believed in ignoring criticism, they would not even be here in the first place. They would simply move on, watch something they enjoy, and not bother engaging with content they dislike. So if people show up angry in the comments, it only highlights that contradiction. It shows that the same advice they give to others is something they are not willing to follow themselves. And that ends up proving the point better than anything else. Fans of Sword Art Online have earned a pretty rough reputation online, and it is not hard to see why people say that. Whenever the series gets criticized, a loud part of the fanbase tends to react in a very defensive way. Instead of accepting that some people simply do not like the show, they jump straight into arguments, insults, or endless debates trying to prove that the criticism is wrong. That kind of reaction is exactly what gives a fanbase a bad image. When people see constant fighting, angry replies, and fans attacking anyone who disagrees with them, it starts to shape how the whole community is viewed. Even if plenty of normal fans exist who just enjoy the series quietly, the loudest voices are often the ones everyone notices, and the pattern keeps repeating. Someone criticizes the show, and instead of ignoring it like they tell others to do, some fans immediately respond with anger and complaints. That contradiction is what makes the behavior look hypocritical. They refuse to ignore criticism themselves. At the end of the day, people are always going to have different opinions about a series. Some will like it, and some will not. But when a fanbase responds to every negative opinion with hostility, it only reinforces the negative reputation that has already formed around it. A lot of fans of Sword Art Online seem to struggle with the idea that not everyone is going to like the franchise. To them, the series is one of the greatest things ever made, and they treat it like it deserves universal praise. Because of that mindset, Any criticism immediately feels like a personal attack rather than just someone sharing a different opinion. Instead of accepting that people have different tastes, some fans act like disliking the series is somehow irrational or unfair. They try to explain away every criticism, argue that people just don't understand it, or insist that critics simply watched it wrong. The possibility that someone might have watched the show and genuinely not enjoyed it often doesn't seem to register. But the reality is that no piece of media is going to appeal to everyone. Every show, game, or movie has people who love it and people who dislike it. That is completely normal. The problem comes when a fanbase refuses to accept that basic fact and treats any negative opinion as something that needs to be fought or corrected. When fans treat Sword Art Online like it is beyond criticism and assume everyone should see it the same way they do, it just makes the community look defensive and closed off. People are allowed to think the series is amazing, and they are also allowed to think it is terrible. Different opinions are part of any fandom, whether people like it or not. Honestly, it can be pretty funny to watch how some fans of Sword Art Online react to criticism. For a lot of people, it is just another anime series, something to watch, enjoy, or dislike, and then move on from. But for certain fans, the franchise seems to become a huge part of their identity. They talk about it constantly, defend it nonstop, and treat it like it is the most important thing ever created. Because of that, any criticism starts to feel like a personal attack to them. If someone says they think the story is weak, the characters are poorly written, or the games look bad, some fans react as if they themselves were insulted. Instead of just saying, "I disagree," and moving on, they jump straight into long arguments trying to defend every little detail. It is like they feel personally responsible for protecting the reputation of the series. That is where the whole thing starts to look ridiculous. When someone ties so much of their identity to a single piece of entertainment, it becomes impossible for them to separate criticism of the franchise from criticism of themselves. The show gets criticized, and suddenly they feel the need to fight back like their own reputation is on the line. At that point, it stops being about simply enjoying an anime and starts looking like their self-worth is somehow connected to whether Sword Art Online gets praised or criticized online. And when people react that strongly over a TV series, it just makes the entire situation seem even more over the top. If you want my advice, it is best to just avoid Sword Art Online and the surrounding fanbase altogether. There are so many better anime, games, and communities out there that are actually worth your time and attention. You are not missing out on anything important by skipping this franchise. The show itself is not nearly as amazing as some people make it out to be. A lot of people criticize the writing, the pacing, and the characters, and those complaints have been around for years. If you are looking for a well-written story or something truly memorable, there are countless other anime that do those things much better. The games are not much better either. Many of them feel like low-effort adaptations that exist mainly because the brand name sells copies. Instead of feeling like carefully crafted experiences, they often come across as generic anime games with the Sword Art Online label slapped on them to attract fans. And then there is the fanbase, which has developed a reputation for being defensive and hostile toward criticism. Not every fan is like that, of course, but the loudest parts of the community tend to make the whole group look rude and toxic to outsiders. So if you are trying to decide whether it is worth getting into the series, the simplest answer might just be to spend your time on something better. There are plenty of shows, games, and communities that are far more enjoyable and far less exhausting to deal with. Sword Art Online is simply not a very good franchise, and that plays a big role in the kind of reputation its fanbase has developed over time. When a series has a lot of flaws but still has extremely defensive supporters, it often creates a strange dynamic where criticism immediately turns into arguments. Because the franchise gets criticized so often, some fans feel like they constantly have to defend it. Instead of just enjoying the series and accepting that other people might not like it, they end up getting dragged into endless debates online. That defensive attitude can slowly turn parts of the fanbase hostile toward anyone who disagrees with them. Over time, that behavior starts to define the image of the community. When people repeatedly see fans arguing, insulting critics, or aggressively defending every little detail of the franchise, it creates the impression that the fandom itself is unpleasant to deal with. That is why the reputation sticks. If a franchise constantly produces arguments, drama, and defensive reactions whenever it gets criticized, people begin to associate those things with the series itself. Eventually, the show and the fanbase start to share the same negative image in the eyes of outsiders. There are plenty of nicer communities out there that are far more enjoyable to be a part of. Not every fandom turns into constant arguments, hostility, and people fighting over every little criticism. In a lot of communities, fans are actually able to talk about the things they enjoy without immediately getting defensive or attacking anyone who disagrees with them. That kind of environment makes a huge difference. When a fan base is relaxed and welcoming, it becomes much easier for people to share opinions, have discussions, and even criticize things without everything turning into a massive argument. People can like different parts of a series, dislike other parts, and still have normal conversations about it. Unfortunately, that is not always the case with fandoms built around something like Sword Art Online, where discussions can quickly turn heated the moment someone says something negative. When that happens over and over again, it just pushes more people away and makes the whole community feel exhausting to deal with. That is why it is usually better to spend your time in communities that are actually fun to interact with. There are countless fanbases where people are more relaxed, more open to different opinions, and far less hostile toward criticism. Being part of a community like that is a much better experience than constantly dealing with drama and arguments. The sad part is that a lot of fans of Sword Art Online probably are not going to change their behavior. When a fanbase develops certain habits over many years, those patterns tend to stick around. Instead of stepping back and reflecting on why the community has such a negative reputation, many fans just dismiss the criticism outright. Rather than asking themselves if there might be some truth behind the complaints, it is easier to shift the blame onto other people. Critics get labeled as haters, trolls, or people who supposedly just want attention. That way, the problem is always framed as someone else being unreasonable instead of looking at how the fanbase itself behaves. Because of that, the cycle keeps repeating. Someone criticizes the franchise. Some fans react aggressively, the argument escalates, and then the fans claim that outsiders are the real problem. There is very little self-reflection in that process. If anything, the backlash often just reinforces the belief that the community is being unfairly attacked. Until people are willing to step back and think about how their reactions might contribute to the reputation of the fandom, nothing is really going to change. The same arguments will keep happening, the same defensive responses will keep showing up, and the same negative image surrounding the Sword Art Online community will continue to stick around. At this point, it honestly feels like there is no real hope for the Sword Art Online community to improve its reputation. The same patterns have been happening for years, and nothing ever seems to change. The same arguments show up, the same defensive reactions happen, and the same hostility toward criticism keeps popping up over and over again. Because of that, expecting the community to suddenly reflect on its behavior and improve does not seem very realistic. If anything, the cycle just keeps repeating itself. Whenever the franchise gets criticized, the response is usually the same: arguments, denial, and blaming other people instead of acknowledging why the criticism exists in the first place. At a certain point, the simplest solution is just to avoid the whole thing entirely. There is really no reason to get dragged into endless debates with fans who have already decided they will never change their minds. Engaging with them usually just turns into a pointless argument that goes nowhere. Nobody ends up learning anything, and nothing productive comes out of it. So the best thing you can do is just keep your distance. Do not interact with them. Do not engage in the arguments. And do not waste your time trying to convince people who have already made up their minds. There are plenty of better communities and discussions out there that are actually worth your time. Before you go, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss any of the hate. Because if this video showed anything, it is that there is a lot to talk about when it comes to Sword Art Online, and this is only the beginning. There are still plenty of things left to rip apart. The show itself has more problems than can fit into a single video. The games keep coming out and somehow keep finding new ways to disappoint. The marketing keeps trying to dress weak ideas up as something exciting. And the fan reactions alone can be a whole topic by themselves. So if you enjoy watching bad ideas get picked apart and overhyped projects get called out for what they are, you might want to stick around. There's going to be a lot more of that. Every time this franchise releases something new, it creates another opportunity to examine it, break it down, and point out everything that goes wrong. And judging by the track record so far, there will not be any shortage of material. So hit the subscribe button, stick around, and make sure you do not miss the next round. Because if this series keeps putting out content like this, there will always be more to criticize. And the hate is definitely not stopping anytime soon.